I wanted to go with her to the prenatal classes. It felt natural. We were expecting a child together, preparing for their arrival as a team. I wanted to be there, involved in everything that mattered during this important phase of our lives. I think I'll go with you to the next class, I said over breakfast, pouring myself a cup of coffee. Susan looked up from her tea, her expression slightly startled, as if she hadn't expected me to say that. Or, more accurately, as if she hadn't wanted me to. Really? She asked, feigning surprise. Of course. I'm the father. I want to be part of the process. She smiled, but not in the way I had hoped. There was no joy in it, just a trace of awkward hesitation. It's just, are you sure you'd find it interesting? She asked, avoiding my eyes. Why wouldn't I? You always say how helpful these classes are. I want to understand what you're going through. It's a little different. It's mostly women there. We talk about things that aren't exactly relevant to men. Pregnancy affects both of us. I want to be there for you, to support you. She hesitated, her spoon lingering in her cup. I just don't want you to be bored. There's nothing there that you couldn't read about in books. Her tone stung. It wasn't exactly a rejection, but it felt like she was desperately looking for a way to keep me from going. So, you don't want me to come? I asked. She stood up from her chair and walked over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders, looking straight into my eyes. Jonathan, please. I need this space. This time for myself. Just trust me, okay? I nodded. I didn't want to pressure her, especially now, when things were already tough. Pregnancy had changed everything. It felt like just yesterday we were dreaming about this moment, and now Susan was 8 months along, and I was doing my best to prepare for fatherhood. We had turned the guest room into a nursery, picked out a stroller, bought tiny little clothes, imagining how, in just a month, there would be a whole new person in our home. Every night, I read parenting books to Susan, and we talked about what our child would be like, debated who they would take after, her or me. I was happy, or at least, I was trying to be, but something about her behavior unsettled me. She had been withdrawing more and more, always saying it was just exhaustion. Sometimes, she seemed too absorbed in her phone. And then there were these classes. She spoke about them with excitement, yet every time I offered to join her, she gently but firmly turned me down. I pushed the doubts aside. It was nothing. In just a month, we would become parents. Nothing should cast a shadow over this moment. I had never picked Susan up from her classes before. She usually got home on her own, and that was just the unspoken routine. But today was different. She had forgotten her phone at home. I only noticed it a couple of hours after she left, and I figured it would be a good idea to drop it off for her. Besides, I had a free day, and I thought maybe we could grab dinner somewhere after her class. The prenatal center was in a small building near Lincoln Park. I parked by the curb and stepped out, just as a group of women poured out of the doors. Some were laughing, chatting with each other, while others exchanged goodbyes, making plans for the next session. Susan wasn't among them. I moved closer, glancing inside the half-open door. The spacious room still had a few people lingering. A handful of women sat on soft mats, engaged in conversation, and standing in the middle of them was a man. Tall, athletic, he stood out from the rest. Short blonde hair, a confident smile, animated expressions. He was speaking to one of the women, and she was laughing. Not nervously, not out of politeness, but genuinely. That was a great class, Mark, she said. You always know how to lift our spirits. Mark, a name Susan had mentioned more than once. She had told me how he helped expectant mothers feel more confident, how supportive he was, how he had a way of connecting with everyone. I wasn't sure what I had expected, but it wasn't this. Mark didn't just look like an instructor. He was someone who knew how to charm people. There was something magnetic about him. And then I saw her. Susan emerged from a back room, fixing her hair. She said something to Mark, and he laughed in response. Then, she lightly touched his arm. So subtle, but enough. A tight, unpleasant knot formed in my chest. It wasn't just a friendly touch. It looked natural, like something that had happened many times before. I froze in the doorway, unsure of what to do. Should I call out to her? Wait in the car? Pretend I hadn't seen anything? I decided to just stand and watch. Susan didn't notice me. She kept talking to Mark, her eyes bright with emotion. She seemed different here. Freer. More at ease. I thought about how she had discouraged me from coming to these classes. How she had said she needed her own space. Why? A few minutes later, she finally said goodbye to Mark and turned toward the exit. That's when she saw me. I caught the flicker of surprise on her face, mixed with something else. Jonathan? She blinked, as if unsure I was really there. You forgot your phone. I held it out, watching her reaction. Oh, thanks. I didn't even notice. She smiled nervously, but I could tell something was off. How long have you been here? She asked. About 10 minutes. She held her breath for a second, as if quickly deciding what to say next. Did you come to pick me up? Yeah. Thought we could have dinner together. She nodded, but something in her face shifted. I glanced back at Mark. He was talking to another woman now, but briefly looked in our direction. When our eyes met, he gave me a nod, friendly, but too self-assured. That's your instructor? I asked, feigning casual curiosity. Yes. You two know each other well? Well, of course. He leads the classes. He's a great instructor. Too quick. Too defensive. I didn't push further. All right. Let's go. I already made a reservation. We walked out and got into the car. A heavy silence filled the space between us. I wasn't expecting you, Susan said after a pause. I just wanted to surprise you. She smiled, but I could feel her mind was elsewhere. I started the engine and pulled onto the road. Everything seemed normal, but deep inside, something had shifted. Something was wrong. A few weeks passed after that night at the prenatal center. I hadn't forgotten it, but I tried not to dwell on it. Or rather, I tried to convince myself I wasn't dwelling on it. The truth was, my thoughts never left it. I kept telling myself I was overthinking things, that it was just stress, exhaustion. Susan was still the same. Still caring, still laughing at my jokes, still rubbing her belly in the evenings with a warm smile as she looked at me. But I couldn't shake the feeling. That shadow between us. It was subtle, but it was there. Then came that evening. We were at a small gathering at our friend's house, Rob and Catherine. A cozy home in Lakeview, dim lighting, soft music, quiet conversations, laughter. Everything felt normal. Susan sat on the couch, chatting with the women, her hand resting habitually on her belly. She looked happy, relaxed. I was drinking whiskey with Rob, half listening to him complain about work, while two of his friends carried on their own conversation nearby. I wasn't paying much attention until I heard a name that made me freeze. Mark? That Mark? One of them asked. Yeah, the guy who runs those prenatal classes, the other replied. He had a whole situation a few years back. I kept my focus on Rob, pretending to be engaged, but my ears were locked onto the conversation next to me. What situation? There was a scandal. He had an affair with one of his students. She was married, pregnant at the time. Her husband found out, did a DNA test. The kid wasn't his. No way. Swear to God. Huge mess. She ended up divorcing her husband, moved somewhere else, and Mark just kept on teaching like nothing happened. I froze. A memory flashed through my mind, the scene in the prenatal center. Susan. Mark. The way she touched his arm. The way she looked at him. He's a great instructor. You wouldn't understand. It's a women's space. I just don't want you to be bored. Words that had once seemed harmless now sounded different. I set my glass down and took a deep breath. John? You all right? Rob asked. Yeah, just thinking, I murmured. The relaxed evening suddenly didn't feel so relaxed. I turned my head, scanning the room, until my eyes landed on Susan. She was laughing at something Catherine had said, her eyes sparkling, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking her belly. She looked peaceful, content. But what if it was all a lie? What if the shadow between us wasn't just in my head, but a warning? I looked away, my fists clenching involuntarily. The easygoing warmth of the night was gone. Something else was taking its place. I needed to find out the truth. After that party, I couldn't get Mark out of my head. Everything fit together too perfectly, like a trap that had been set, and I was only now beginning to see its outline. I wanted to talk to Susan. I wanted the truth. But life, as always, had other plans. That morning, she looked exhausted. Her skin was pale, dark circles heavy under her eyes. I noticed her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a glass of water. "You feeling okay?" I asked, putting my phone down. "Just tired," she murmured, closing her eyes. "You sure? Maybe we should call the doctor." She shook her head but then winced and pressed a hand to her belly. "I think it hurts." I was on my feet in an instant. "Get dressed. We're going to the hospital." She didn't argue, and that scared me more than anything. The drive was tense. I kept glancing at her, worried, but she sat silently, gripping the armrest, her face strained. At the ER, they took her in right away. I was left pacing in the hallway, unable to sit still. Maybe I'd been too hard on her. Maybe these classes and my suspicions didn't matter. Maybe all that mattered now was her health. When the doctor finally came out, I stood frozen, swallowing the lump in my throat. "She's fine. Just stress and exhaustion. She needs more rest." I nodded, but something inside me clenched. Stress. From what? When we got home, I helped her into bed. "You need anything?" "No," she whispered, eyes already closing. "Just need to lie down for a bit." I sat beside her, watching her. She looked so fragile, so drained. I covered her hand with mine and felt the faint tremor in her fingers. Whatever was happening, I'd deal with it later. Right now, the only thing that mattered was that she and the baby were okay. Later, as I went to the kitchen to make her some tea, my eyes landed on something on the nightstand. Her phone. She'd forgotten it again. This wasn't the first time. Ever since she started taking those classes, her absent-mindedness had become more noticeable. I picked up the phone, intending to place it beside her. Then the screen lit up. A message from Mark. I froze. My eyes instinctively darted to the text. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" A chill ran down my spine. I gripped the phone tighter, feeling my pulse hammer in my ears. Shit. I slowly sank into a chair, staring at the screen. The message was still glowing there, unblinking, unwavering. "Are you sure he doesn't suspect anything?" The world around me seemed to constrict. The walls closed in, the air thickened, and a low buzzing filled my ears until I could barely hear my own breathing. I read the words over and over again, as if I could somehow force them to change, as if blinking would make the text disappear, leaving behind nothing but silence. But it didn't disappear. It burned into me, branding a single, undeniable truth into my mind. I'd been betrayed. I placed the phone back on the nightstand with careful precision. My fingers were trembling slightly, but I clenched them into a fist. Inside, something was boiling, but I couldn't afford to lose control. No, I wasn't going to make a scene. I wasn't going to wake her up, shake her by the shoulders, demand answers. I had to be smart. I had to be cold. I stood up and walked to the window, staring at my reflection in the glass. The man staring back at me was a stranger. Normally, my emotions were easy to read. If I was happy, it showed. If I was angry, it showed. But now, I looked empty. Dark eyes, a clenched jaw, a body wound tight, bracing for something. I could feel it, something new forming inside me. Something cold, something I hadn't known was there before. I turned back to the phone. How long had it been going on? How many messages like this had she received? How long had she been lying to me? I took a step closer but didn't reach for the phone again. I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed proof. I returned to the bedroom. Susan lay curled on her side, breathing evenly, peacefully. That peace choked me. How could she sleep so easily when my reality was falling apart? I thought back to the moment she first told me she was pregnant. Her tears of joy. The way she had placed my hand on her belly, whispering that we were going to be parents. And now I stood here in the dark, wondering whose child she was carrying. Mine? Or his? I shut my eyes, inhaled deeply. I had to find out the truth. I didn't want to hear her lies. I didn't want to listen to excuses, to empty reassurances that I was imagining things. I needed real answers, and I was going to get them. I knew I wouldn't find peace until I knew the truth. The question, "Is this my child?" had rooted itself in my mind like poison, spreading through my veins with each passing day. I couldn't look at Susan without thinking about it. Couldn't hear her voice, her laughter, without wondering what she was hiding. I took the DNA test the moment the baby was born. Susan suspected nothing. She was happy. She held the baby in her arms, called him ours, looked at me with love, the kind of love I no longer believed in. "He looks just like you," she said, smiling. I looked at the baby, but I didn't see myself. I couldn't. I waited. The days dragged on painfully. I smiled, held the baby, said all the right things, played the role expected of me. But inside, I was dying. The results arrived 2 weeks later. I was home alone when I opened the envelope. The house was silent, save for the memory of newborn cries that had filled the space only days before. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. My eyes scanned the lines. Probability of paternity, 0%. That was it. Simple numbers. They didn't scream. They didn't demand tears. They didn't cut like a knife. They simply existed, like a sentence. I wasn't the father. I don't know how long I stared at that paper. I don't know when my fingers started gripping it so tightly that the edges crumpled. Inside me, there was nothing but emptiness. I hadn't just lost my wife. I had lost the child I had been waiting for. The child I had already begun to love. The life I had built in my head. All those nights, falling asleep while imagining who he would become, who he would take after. None of it was real. There was only a lie. Somewhere in the distance, my phone buzzed. Susan. She was texting me, asking what she should pick up on the way home. As if nothing had happened. As if she hadn't destroyed me from the inside out. I stared at the screen. My breathing was steady. I knew what I had to do. I knew that today would be the last day she would look me in the eyes and believe everything was under control. Tonight, I would expose her. I could have simply disappeared, left a note, filed for divorce, erased her from my life. But that wasn't enough. Susan didn't deserve a quiet exit. She deserved to feel the truth hit her just as hard as it had hit me. She deserved to watch her world collapse the way mine had. So I made sure it would. I planned a dinner. A warm, intimate gathering, just how she liked it. I invited her parents, our friends, even Mark. "You sure?" she asked when I told her. "Of course," I smiled. "We need to celebrate." She looked surprised but didn't suspect a thing. Of course not. She thought she was untouchable. The evening was perfect. Everyone sat around the table, wine flowing, conversations light and effortless. Susan laughed, her eyes glowing with happiness. She looked relaxed, content. I waited. I let her enjoy this last hour of her life. The life where she was still a wife, a mother, a beloved daughter and friend. I let her feel safe. Then, I stood up. "Thank you all for coming," I said, raising my glass. "Tonight is special." The room quieted. I felt Susan tense beside me. I turned to her and smiled. "Tonight is a night of truth." I pulled the envelope from my pocket and unfolded it. The room went still. Only seconds ago, there had been laughter. Now, the air had turned thick, suffocating. Susan went pale. I held her gaze as I spoke. "This child is not mine." Silence. Heavy. Burning. Her mother's eyes widened. Her father's lips pressed into a tight line. Catherine dropped her fork. Susan opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. I unfolded the paper and read aloud. Probability of paternity, 0%. I turned to Mark. He was frozen. I saw his fingers slowly clench into fists. "You," I nodded at him. "This your work?" "Jonathan," he started, but I laughed. "Do you even realize what she lost because of you?" I looked back at Susan. She didn't look confident anymore. She looked broken. "You lost me," I said. "But that's not all." I turned to her parents. "You were proud of her, weren't you?" They said nothing. I watched as her mother turned away. Her father closed his eyes, as if trying to process what was happening. Then, quietly, without a word, he pushed his chair back and stood. "We're leaving," he said. "Dad," Susan's voice cracked. He didn't respond. Her mother rose too. They walked out, silently. They didn't hug her. They didn't say a word. They just left. I turned to our friends. Rob stared at her with disgust. Catherine wouldn't even look at her. Their silence spoke louder than anything. She wasn't their friend anymore. Then, I turned to Mark. He was already shifting in his seat, ready to leave. I stepped closer. And you? I smirked. You gonna take her? Be the responsible one? He didn't answer. Come on, Mark, I pressed. You're the great seducer of pregnant women. Don't walk away now. Susan looked at him, pleading. Mark, please. He averted his gaze. Sorry, he muttered. Just one word. But it destroyed her more than anything I had said. He turned and left, leaving her alone. I looked at Susan one last time. She sat at the table, alone, surrounded by abandoned silverware, half-filled wine glasses, and the weight of a gaze no one could meet. I hope it was worth it, I said. I grabbed my jacket and walked out. Because there was no us, no family, no life together anymore. There was only a shattered dream, and a woman who now had nothing. You can't do this to me, Jonathan. Her voice was raw, teetering on the edge of hysteria. I turned slowly. She stood in the bedroom doorway, her hair disheveled, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked lost. You said you loved me, she whispered. How can you just walk away? I laughed. It was a hollow, empty sound. Just walk away? I stepped closer, and she instinctively took a step back. You call this just walking away? Susan, you destroyed everything. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. It was a mistake. I got confused. You what? I cut her off. You accidentally slept with him? Accidentally got pregnant? Accidentally lied to my face while I was preparing to be a father? She flinched, as if I had struck her. But I wasn't even yelling. The anger was gone. All that was left was cold, biting contempt. I never wanted it to turn out like this, her voice cracked. But it did. She took a shaky step toward me, her fingers clutching at my sleeve. Jonathan, please. I looked at her hands, the same hands that had held me on nights when we dreamed of our future. Now, they meant nothing. I pulled away sharply, breaking her grip. You broke this. She shook her head, whispering no under her breath. You think I'll leave you with anything? She froze. I saw fear flicker across her face. What do you mean? I smirked. This house, the car, our accounts, everything, it's mine. You can't, her voice was hoarse. I already did. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes darting wildly, like a trapped animal. Where am I supposed to go? That's not my problem. I grabbed my bag and walked toward the door. Susan lunged at me, her fingers grasping at my jacket. Please, don't leave me. I turned to her slowly. She was sobbing. For the first time, she looked like someone who had lost everything. You chose this, Susan. I pried her hands off me and opened the door. You're on your own. I walked out, and I never looked back. She called, texted, left voicemail after voicemail, first apologizing, then begging, then raging. I never answered. To me, she no longer existed.